Ready to dive into something different. We're talking feral Aryan femininity.
Yeah, the title's a lot, I know, provocative, maybe even a little off-putting, but that's why we're here. You shared this article, Feral Aryan Femininity, Blonde Women as Bioweapons. It's, well, let's say it's a wild ride, and we're going to break it all down.
Definitely wild. And we're jumping right in.
Head first.
Yep.
So the article starts off swinging, takes aim at that classic warrior woman trope, Xena, Lagertha, all those powerful figures, often right there with men on the battlefield.
Right, the equals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the author is saying, hold on a minute, not so fast. Not just physically, but like from a whole evolutionary standpoint, this just doesn't add up.
It's a really interesting point. I mean, think about it. Ancient societies, women are incredibly valuable, right? The ability to bear children, that's everything.
They're carrying the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to put them in a role where they're, expected to be frontline soldiers, it's a risk most cultures wouldn't and honestly couldn't really take.
Survival of the tribe literally depends on that.
And the author even brings up the Cimbrian War around 100 BC. The Cimbri, they were a Germanic tribe, and they'd bring women and children on campaigns, not as fighters, but still. Just imagine the psychological impact.
Oh, absolutely. Talk about high stakes.
Yeah.
We actually have accounts that back this up. Plutarch, he talked about the Cimbrian women at the Battle of Vercellae. They were defending the baggage trains, and when it was clear they were losing, they chose mass suicide over capture.
They chose death.
Yeah. They even killed their own children rather than see them enslaved.
Wow.
Which, tells you something about their mindset, this deep-seated resistance to subjugation, refusing to be anyone's spoils of war.
Intense is an understatement. So we're already seeing this power that's not about brute force. It's something deeper, more complex, which brings us to the Valkyries.
Right, because most people, they hear Valkyrie and they picture, winged figures, beautiful, otherworldly.
Right, out of a movie.
Exactly, but it's so much more than that. This article, it digs deep into their actual place in Norse society, and it's a place that requires us to really think differently about them.
Like we've had to rethink witches over time.
That's a great comparison. We've gone from seeing them as purely supernatural to recognizing their potential roles in their communities, both practical and, spiritual. We need to look at Valkyries through a similar lens.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The article makes a connection between Valkyries and other warrior cultures, like the Scythians. They were known for their female horse warriors.
Right, and what's fascinating is you start to see this potential for a much more grounded role for the Valkyries. Maybe even a presence on the battlefield, not just these ethereal figures.
So not just wives, not just, serving mead in the halls of Valhalla.
Exactly. And while the historical record's a bit fuzzy, there's evidence that these women, they weren't just on the sidelines. For example, there's this Norse saga, the Rafsmal, and it describes a Valkyrie encountering a raven covered in gore.
Okay, now that's an image.
Right. And the language, it's visceral. It suggests a real familiarity with violence, with the aftermath of battle. It's not the typical maiden in distress imagery.
Not at all. This is heavy stuff. And that's where the article takes an even darker turn, suggesting that part of their power came from a potential role as, wait for it, executioners.
Yeah, it's a tough concept, but think about it in context. These societies, they didn't have formal law enforcement like we do today. The author argues that the Valkyries, they might have been the ones to cull the weak, reinforce this brutal form of selective breeding, one that favored strength, ruthlessness. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. It's a lot. So they're tending to the wounded, deciding who lives, who dies, and maybe even playing a role in shaping the future of the tribe itself.
That's the theory the article is putting forward, and it definitely makes you think.
Absolutely, it really does.
And that connection to violence, it gets even more intense when the article brings up human sacrifice.
Right, and not just like random acts of violence. We're talking rituals woven into the fabric of these cultures.
Exactly. And there's this fascinating comparison the article makes between Germanic, Viking societies, and the Aztecs.
Okay, I'm intrigued because both used sacrifice, but it sounds like they went about it in totally different ways.
They did. See, the Aztecs, with their polygamous society, they had way more men. And the article argues that they used sacrifice as a way to kind of, maintain order, to use their phrasing.
Keep things in check. But the Germanic tribes, they were constantly at war.
Always.
So they couldn't afford to lose their women. They were too precious, too valuable.
Exactly. They needed to protect them. Even if it meant, and this is where it gets really interesting, even if it meant making them less appealing to their enemies.
Less appealing. Okay, now I'm really curious. How do you make someone less appealing through, sacrifice.
Well, this is where the author brings in that account from Ibn Fadlan,
The Arab traveler.
the one and only.
Oh.
He wrote about this Viking funeral, really graphic stuff. And there's this slave girl who volunteers to be sacrificed alongside her master, to say the least. And the author uses this story to illustrate this idea of selective breeding. But this time, they're not breeding for physical strength or anything like that. They're breeding for female resistance to subjugation.
So she's volunteering to die instead of being taken as...
Ibn Fadlan uses the term concubine.
Right. Essentially, someone's property.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the article argues that this might not have been a one-off, that maybe there was immense social pressure to choose death over capture.
A way to avoid a life of,
Of hardship, of being someone else's possession.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So the women who wouldn't choose that, the ones who would resist, even in the face of death.
They're taken out of the equation, so to speak. Whether intentionally or not, these cultures might have been selecting for a very specific kind of woman, one who was fiercely independent, resistant to any kind of control from the outside, a woman who would defend her freedom, even if it meant dying for it.
It's a lot to process. So these brutal rituals, as horrific as they were.
And they were horrific. We can't forget that.
Of course not. But are you saying that they might have actually given women more power in a way?
It's a possibility the article raises, and it's a question worth considering, because it makes you think about power in a whole new light, about survival, about what it really means to be free in a society so completely different from our own.
The author even uses the term bioweaponization to describe this whole thing.
Right, which is...
A lot.
It's a lot. Definitely a loaded term. And it's important to remember, this is just one interpretation.
Right. It's one way of looking at it. And before we get into more modern interpretations of this, remember how we started challenging that warrior woman trope.
Right, back to the beginning.
Well, the article ends by kind of doing the same thing, but with a very different target, something much more modern. So the article takes us on this journey, right? From ancient rituals and sacrifices straight to, well, the boardroom.
Yeah, and it's a heck of a jump.
Yeah.
Because suddenly we're talking about, get this, the overrepresentation of blonde women in CEO positions.
Okay, I will admit that's not where I thought we were going.
Right. It's a little jarring, to say the least. And this is where the article ventures into some pretty speculative territory. It tries to draw this direct line between, and I'm using their words here, feral femininity in those ancient cultures, to, well, the supposed dominance of blonde women in power positions today.
Dominance, that's a loaded word.
Absolutely. And we got to be careful here because the article doesn't shy away from making some pretty sweeping generalizations about different ethnicities, different cultures. And we want to be crystal clear here. This isn't about endorsing those views, not at all. Our goal here is to explore the ideas, put them out there, but it's up to you listening to draw your own conclusions.
Exactly. We're just here to, lay out the map, so to speak.
Exactly. And you know what I find interesting? It's not even necessarily the claim itself, but what it says about us. What does it say about our culture that we're even asking this question?
It's almost like we're still trying to figure out those ancient rules, those power dynamics.
Right. Except instead on a battlefield, it's playing out in boardrooms, in those fancy corner offices.
Exactly. And that, I think, is where the real value of this whole deep dive comes in. It's not about agreeing with every little thing.
It's about asking the uncomfortable questions.
Challenging what we think we know.
And maybe, just maybe, uncovering these hidden connections between, well, everything.
Between the past and present.
Exactly.
I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. Ancient battlefields, Viking funerals, boardrooms. We even talked about bioweapons. And it all circles back to this idea of power. Who has it? Who wants it? How do we get it?
And how do we understand it? Especially when we're talking about these ancient cultures, so different from our own.
So as you go about your day, think about those Valkyries, those Cimbrian women, and ask yourself, what echoes of the past do you see in the world around you? And what do those echoes tell us about ourselves? Thanks for joining us for this incredible deep